this, and they didn't, they cannot say we were analphabets.
Okay, shall we get started? Ready? Good. We'll get started. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program here at the Wilson Center, and very much like to welcome you to this Cold War Project seminar on U.S. public opinion and the Carter administration's response to the Charter 77. Really an occasion to celebrate the publication of a remarkable compilation of documents produced by Charter 77. And we'll be hearing a little more about it in a few minutes. It's this 3-volume set you see in front of our speakers. They are produced and edited by...
As a gift for you.
Oh, that's even better. Edited and produced by Professor Vilem Precan, who I'll briefly introduce at first. Vilem Precan, as a biographical piece on him that I found started out, used to be an idealistic man of the left who, before he cast a critical eye on the history of what was once Czechoslovakia. Well, in this article that I found, Professor Precan is quoted, "More than anything else, I wanted to be an academic historian, the kind who sits in an archive and then publishes books. But life took another course. If in the beginning his eyes were clouded by communist propaganda, everyday life and research in the archives set him on the right path. After studying and graduating from Prague's Charles University, he served as a lecturer in Marxism-Leninism at the Comenius University in Bratislava, now in the independent Slovak Republic. There he met his wife and acquainted himself with the history of the 1944 Slovak uprising. He went on to compile 2 volumes of documents on the subject." Precan was a researcher at the Historical Institute in Prague when he and other colleagues were given the, I guess, fateful task of documenting the 1968 Soviet invasion. Originally planned as a small brochure, the history grew to a thick book. Its publication, by chance in a black cover, infuriated the Soviets and led to Precan's fall from grace. He worked for many years in more menial jobs and then chose life in exile and settled in Germany, where he set up an important center for Samizdat literature, now the Czechoslovak Documentation Center. In 2001, the Slovak Academy of Sciences honored Dr. Precan for his 2 volumes on the Slovak uprising. He went on to produce a host of other document compilations and important monographs, including a co-edited volume on the Prague Spring, published in the National Security Archives document reader series at Central European University Press. He is, as mentioned, the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Czechoslovak Documentation Center, which collected the works of dissident authors and exiles. He returned home after the Velvet Revolution, founding the Institute for Contemporary History in 1998, recognizing his struggle for civic and human rights. Then President Václav Havel, who Professor Precan knows well, in fact exchanged many hundreds of letters with, and
250.
250.
During the 80s.
During the 1980s, all of which are at the Hoover Institution in Stanford, California. Havel awarded him the Order of Thomas Masaryk. It's with great pleasure to welcome back an old friend, a longtime partner, I would say one of the Czech Republic's, of the Slovak Republic's national treasures, and it's wonderful to have you back. Vilem, you've got the floor.
Many thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank the Woodrow Wilson Center and above all my dear friend Christian Ostermann for the kind invitation, and also Mr. Mircea Munteanu for organizing our session today. Some of you may have had an opportunity to look through the January 2007 feature of the National Security Archives, Charter 77 after 30 years. Nevertheless, allow me to make a couple of introductory remarks concerning the phenomenon of Charter 77. At the very beginning, Charter 77 was only a human rights manifesto, very critical to the situation in Czechoslovakia. One, a declaration of intent signed by its signatories and represented by 3 spokesmen. Strictly speaking, the actual charter was the initial declaration of January 1, 1977. Its 3 spokespersons, they would eventually be 35 during the 13 years of its existence, 77 to 89, and signatories of the January 1977 declaration. They, the signatories, never met before March 1990, except in small groups, or once December 10, 1988, when the Chartists were exceptionally allowed to hold a meeting in a Prague square for 1 hour only, probably thanks to the presence in Prague of François Mitterrand, who was on a state visit to Czechoslovakia. There were 241 signatories at first. By March 7, 1977, there were 617 and 700 by the end of 1977. By the end of 1989, 1,889 in all, of which 440 had signed as late as 1989. Joining Charter 77 meant nothing more and nothing less than signing the initial declaration and accepting the obligations stemming from it, taking responsibility only in accord with one's own conscience. Charter 77 was ultimately its documents. Tangibly, Charter 77 left behind only these texts. The range of topics of the documents, whose authenticity was vouched for by the spokesman, was truly wide, covering all areas of the Charter 77 agenda. In them, the Charter discussed the purpose of its existence, its aims and intentions. It dealt here both with individual cases of human and civil rights abuses and with whole spheres of the lives or interests of society. With this monitoring activity, Charter 77 explained and cast light on practically all spheres of life in Czechoslovakia: the social sphere, the economy and the arts, the courts, the school system, the natural environment, the healthcare system, the prison system, the practices of the authorities limiting Czechoslovaks' freedom to travel abroad, the forms and method of discrimination against Czechoslovaks in employment and in their vocations, the status of minorities and the religious institutions, the situation in the practice of religion. Independent of the regime machinery, these were often the only uncensored pieces of information about the state of the country. Through the lens of the 2 international covenants on human, civil, economic, social and cultural rights, Charter 77 thus also assessed the whole Czechoslovak legal system. It documented in detail the Czechoslovak laws, that contravened the international obligations of the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic and proposed solutions. Charta 77 carefully monitored the Helsinki process. All the follow-up meetings of the CSCE and also at its individual phases, it presented Czechoslovak politicians with proposals for ways Czechoslovakia could actively contribute to achieving the agreed aims. Even in the first years of its existence, the Charter had in its documents spoken out on many clearly political matters. Beginning in 1978, it was publishing a statement on the 1968 Soviet-led military intervention with the demand to have the Soviet army withdraw from Czechoslovakia, and later with other political demands as well. It repeatedly concerned itself with the situation in Poland and published several brave, open declarations which clearly warned against Czechoslovakia's intervening in Polish affairs. As its international contacts and work inside and outside the Soviet bloc expanded, the number of documents also increased. With these, Charta 77 communicated with institutions, forums, civic action groups, and individuals in Czechoslovakia and abroad, and also reported on this communication to the public at home. No matter whom a Charter document may have been explicitly addressed to, Chartists and the people working with them went to great efforts from the very beginning to publish and distribute the documents among the Czechoslovak public at large. Evidence of this is the vast collections of samizdat. In this way, the Charter helped to form an independent public, a public space, a counterpole to the pseudo-public controlled and manipulated by the police and regime-loyal mass media. From its emergence until the end 1989, Charta 77 published 598 documents, which fill 2 volumes of the recently published documentation on Charta 77. At the very beginning, Charta was only a declaration of intent, as I said. But if we can grasp what Charta 77 became, we realize that the story of the Charter is extraordinarily complex, with many levels and dimensions. Smaller stories about everything the Charter became. With the Charter, an era in Czechoslovakia began, coming on shaky little bird legs, of politics aiming towards the renewal of civil society, democracy, and a legal system founded on the unconditional recognition of human and civil rights. The story of the Charter is thus the story of an act born of moral motives, but one that became political. The story of civic action which aimed to force the regime to do what the regime had proclaimed it would do, rather than to bring down the regime. But it was the most radical possible challenge to the regime. The principles of the indivisibility of freedom and the universal validity of civil and human rights, which the Charta 70 advocated, was an antipole of communist doctrine and practice. So Charta's story is the story of the formation of focal points and islands of civil society, the formation of an independent space for the discussion of current political questions, and for all kinds of other civic activity too. It is the story of the viability of the legacy of a philosopher who could identify the crucial importance of the new spiritual orientation which entered society with the Charter, to remind one that people today again know, as he wrote, that there are things worth suffering and living for. It is the story of a community that was formed in the first 9 months of 1977 and never ceased to question itself, repeatedly inquire into the point of its efforts. It is also the story of young people who did not want to conform to the consumerist way of life in real existing socialism and came out instead in support of the Charter, even though they were the easiest target of regime repressions. The story of Charter 77 can be seen and researched as the story of international solidarity and collaboration both through the Iron Curtain and within the Soviet sphere, as well as a story of effective collaboration between democrats in Czechoslovakia and in exile. Such a level of collaboration between people at home and in exile had been unthinkable in previous decades, as in 1970s and 80s. It is the story of people who spoke only for themselves, who did not want to represent anyone, and yet became, for the free world, a symbol of the best that was happening in Czechoslovakia. And it is therefore also the story of the return of Czechoslovakia to the political map of Europe as a country that not only suffered oppression from the outside and inside, but also had people who were trying to achieve freedom and rights for all and were prepared to make sacrifices to bring about a civil society thus conceived. The story of the Charter is the story of a structure. Then, in the last 2 years of its life, before the changes that began mid-November 1989, almost dissolved into a number of new civic action groups, opposition groups, and largely political groups, which Chartists had helped to bring to life, most strikingly the movement for civil rights with its Democracy for Everyone manifesto from October 1988. The Charter was also the story of the formation of a political elite which was able to carry out a historic task at the right moment, namely to represent a self-emancipating rising public and put itself at the head of the political revolution to unite forces for a decade of active dissent with everyone who had joined the movement of resistance to totalitarianism in the course of 1989 or even at the very moment it collapsed. Just as the Charter for the 14 years of its existence was continuously exploring the possibilities and limits of civic action in Czechoslovakia, so too can the history of that whole period be explored through the history of Charter 77. But, and this I would like to stress, before the so-called great history of Charter 77 is written, the milieu in which the Charter was operating has to be studied, and the history of Czechoslovak society in the 1970s and 80s has to be mapped out. Only that will provide credible answers to questions such as why Charter 77 did not take root in Slovakia, or why in Poland, after the Workers' Defense Committee, KOR, Solidarność came, whereas in Czechoslovakia, for a full 10 years, it was only Charter 77 and the Committee for the Defense of the Unjustly Prosecuted that were taking a clear stand. But the social history of Czechoslovakia in 1970s and 1980s exists only as a research project and is still to be written. And now to the very topic of our session, US public opinion and the Carter administration's response to Charter 77. To research this, we have at our disposal the following sources: the US press, of which the New York Times and the Washington Post are the most important and easy to study. the printed congressional records, documents from the Jimmy Carter Library, that is the White House records, 1977-80, publications of the CSCE Helsinki Commission of the US Congress, and CIA records. Although we do not have the State Department records of the time, we are very fortunate that, thanks to the efforts of the National Security Archive, the US Department of State in January 2007 made available 85 dispatches to and from the US Embassy in Prague, written in January and February 1977, which in one way or another relate to Charter 77. Let's consider briefly what we can learn from these telegrams. Unlike the West German embassy, whose first report on the preparations for a, quote, new spectacular act with which critics of the regime wish to bring attention to human rights violation in the country, was sent from Prague to Bonn as early as 5 p.m. December 30, 1976. The US Embassy in Prague sent its first message on Charter 77 to Washington on January 7, saying, Charter 77 statement has not yet reached us, but we understand it is legalistic rather than strident in tone, unquote. And 4 days later, January 11, it noted, the Czechoslovak dissidents' Charter 77 declaration is still very much a story in the making, and it will be some time before the dust settles. At the time, for its information of this kind, the US Embassy in Prague depended on the West Germany Embassy, Malcolm Brown of the New York Times, who was incidentally present in Prague, and the international press. On January 19, the US Embassy in Prague transmitted to Washington what it called an unofficial embassy translation of the text of Charter 77. This report crossed with the telegram from the State Department, still signed by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. The State Department requested for the first time, quote, if at all possible, Department would appreciate Embassy obtaining, perhaps from the first German Embassy, full Czech text with full or at least partial list of signatories of Charter 77 and any follow-up document which may be in existence. The exchange of information about Charter 77 between the US Embassy in Prague and the State Department increased immediately after Jimmy Carter took office as president, and Cyrus Vance, Secretary of State. As early as January 25, the State Department morning summary of significant reports placed a report entitled Charter 77 Hurts Prague's Image as its number 2 item. It is based on the US Embassy in Prague telegram from January 21, which reads. Embassy Prague reports that Charter 77 has moved into the international arena as its subscribers seek support from abroad and the government attempts to link dissident movement with external forces. If the atmosphere worsens, NATO and neutral signatories of the CSCE Final Act may not improve relations with the unpopular Prague regime. In the evening of the same day, January 25, the State Department sent to Prague a department's press guidance on Charter 77. It was identical to the State Department statement at a press conference in Washington next day, January 26. Quote, as we understand the situation in Czechoslovakia, some 300 individuals has petitioned the government to guarantee the rights accorded them by the Czechoslovak Constitution, the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights, and on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and by the Helsinki Final Act. We have noted that the signers of Charter 77 explicitly state that it is not a document of political opposition. Some of the signers have reportedly been detained or harassed. Quote, quoting the provision of the Helsinki Agreement, the statement concluded, all signatories of the Helsinki Final Act are pledged to promote, respect and observe human rights and fundamental freedoms for all. We must strongly deplore the violation of such rights and freedoms wherever they occur. This statement, unusually strong in the time, was rejected by the Czechoslovak Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs, Spáčil, who called the US ambassador in Prague, Bern, on January 31. Spáčil attacked this statement as interference in Czechoslovakia's internal affairs, and as such, he claimed the US government had violated the CSCE Final Act. The matter became the subject of a long telegram from Prague dated February 1, which gives a very good picture about the argumentation used by Czechoslovak officials. Even before, in the telegram to Washington from January 25, the US ambassador raised the question of how the efforts of the Czechoslovak regime to suppress the dissidents who have band together under Charta 77 will inevitably affect US-Czechoslovak relations. The ambassador elaborate argumentation and proposal based on the principle that it would be wrong to play the game of business as usual, which the Czechoslovak government wanted to play, was fully confirmed in the State Department telegram of February 10. I quote from this telegram from the State Department. The department very much appreciates your excellent thoughts and recommendations on the effect of Charta 77 on our bilateral relations. There has been considerable public and official concern here over the Charta 77 episode. As reflected in our statement to the press of January 26, we continue to watch the situation very closely, and we appreciate the extensively embassy reporting on the subject. Charta 77 may, as you correctly stated, affect the speed with which we move ahead on a broad front in the near future. By limiting the speed in the near future, we can reinforce the expression of our concern over the human rights for individuals whose acts constitute a simple expression of truth rather than an act of political dissidence. Admittedly, for those in power in Prague and in Moscow, descriptive statements of the current Czechoslovak situation amount to a political challenge. Item 4. Regarding the Cultural Scientific Exchange Agreement, Department wished to hold off for the time being on the decision to go ahead with program negotiations in March. We will watch the Charta 77 situation closely and determine whether those talks can take place or whether they should be rescheduled for later in the spring. Item 7. We do not feel that the current situation should inhibit us from pushing for divided families, improved access to officials, or improved media treatment of the US. Regarding the latter, the embassy should at an appropriate occasion note that press implications of US involvement in espionage, subversion are not helpful. An embassy officer should register our concern over the allegations against Voice of America and express our view that such allegations do not contribute to an improved bilateral atmosphere. During February 1977, the US Embassy in Prague continued to report intensively on the Charter, the concentrated party government mass media campaign against it, and the efforts of the Czechoslovak government primarily Foreign Minister Kňoupek, to pursue a business-as-usual course with the outside world in hopes of minimizing damages that the Charter 77 issue has inflicted Czechoslovakia's internal image. Prague Telegram, February 14. 4 days later, February 18, a further telegram on Charter 77 reported, quote, the signers, in spite of this warning, meaning Vasil Bilak's speech at the February 7 meeting of political functionaries, in which he warned that the patience and tolerance of the people were not endless. So, in spite of this warning and continuing sporadic harassments, most Charter 77 leaders are chipper, keeping samizdat typewriters pounding and still willing to talk with foreigners, foreign correspondents. By far not all these telegrams were sent from Prague or from the State Department to Prague. Among the 85 dispatches are telegrams from US embassies in many European capitals, which report on Charter 77 and its repercussions. Once available, declassified as a whole, they will be a useful substitution for time-consuming research using reports in the press, in the international press, particularly if they summarize, like a February 28 dispatch from Bern, which gives a picture of how the Swiss press reported on the overall change from previous US administration policy, particularly an end to the Sonnenfeld doctrine toward Eastern Europe. A few words about White House records related to Charter 77 in the first 2 months on the Charter presidency. Both the Council of Free Czechoslovakia, a group of emigre leaders, and the Czechoslovak National Council of America soon were in touch with Zbigniew Brzezinski, supplying him with Charter 77 documents and reports on Czechoslovakia. Among the documents related to Charter 77 in the Jimmy Carter Library, I found a letter from the Czech writer and Charter 77 signatory Pavel Kohout, dated March 3rd, 1977. It is addressed to President Carter, praising Carter's policy on human rights and civil liberties, quote, as a great and first real hope for all the divided world of today. A related memorandum of the National Security Council dated March 12 reads as follows. The President has approved Deputy Secretary Christopher's recommendation that he instruct Ambassador Bern in Prague to meet with Pavel Kohout and thanks him on the President's behalf for his letter. Here is documented too the first action in support of Charter 77 in the US Congress, started by 2 representatives, Millicent Fenwick and James Blanchard, who initiated a letter to the Czechoslovak ambassador in Washington. The letter, signed by another 37 members of Congress, objects, according to a press release of January 21st, to the harassment of a group of Czechoslovaks who have recently signed a human rights petition. In the House of the Representatives, the first report on Charter 77 was made by Dante Fassel, who included in the record a full translation of the Charter 77 manifesto as printed January 7th in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. The same day, in a remark demanding freedom in Czechoslovakia, James Blanchard informed Congress about the letter of 39 representatives to the Czechoslovak ambassador, and brought the House's attention to January 21st Washington Post article on Charter 77 and on its spokesman Jan Patočka. The article was included in the Congressional record too. Two last minutes, please. May I?
Sure.
On February 2nd, Blanchard spoke in House again. He reported on from Czechoslovak ambassador's unsatisfactory reply to the representative's letter, and then included in the record the full text of the Charta 70 manifesto as published in the New York Times, the first full publication of the Charta Declaration in New York Times, January 27, on the occasion of publishing the statement of the State Department. In the Senate, Charta 77 was mentioned for the first time on February 3rd, when Senator Thurmond urged each member of the Senate to study this document, the Charta 77 Declaration, and praised it as a courageous step by those who wrote it and signed it. With the unanimous consent of the Senate, the document from the New York Times was ordered to be printed in the record. Instead of conclusion, I would offer two episodes that illustrate the learning process Western diplomats underwent regarding the Helsinki process. On September 9, 1975, Sir Terence Garvey, British ambassador to the Soviet Union, sent to London the first forecast of the course Soviet foreign policy would take towards the West after the Helsinki summit. He stressed above all that the signing of the Final Act was claimed by the Russians as a great diplomatic success and a major landmark in post-war history. Sir Terence carefully assessed what the Soviets had achieved by signing. He also stated their main debit, however, is in basket 3, and predicted that at the first follow-up meeting in 1977, the Soviets would concentrate on basket 1, though they must fear that the main business of the 1977 meeting will be Western and indeed neutral pestering about Soviet and East European fulfillment of humanitarian and other provisions in basket 3. But he concluded with a warning. Mishandled by the West, the pursuit of detente could lead to a Soviet walkover in Europe. In these views, we find no trace yet of the idea that an actor other than the governments of the participating states could play a role in the Helsinki process. About 16 months later, the young French caricaturist Jean Planturé precisely captured the existence of another factor in the Helsinki process when he drew between the letters L and S. Please let it circulate. Yeah? Okay. Of the Helsinki banner, triumphantly held aloft by Brezhnev, the silhouette of a little man raising his own little Helsinki banner. The caricature, which Le Monde published below its first report on Charta 77 in the January 7, 1977 edition, aptly depicts the emergence of a phenomenon that had not been foreseen by either the West or Moscow and her satellites on 1st August 1975, namely the Helsinki process from below, a movement of citizens who began to demand that the governments of their countries should meet their obligations in the area of human and civil rights and would publicly criticize their violations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vilem.
Was it too long?
You're good. You're good. It was perfect. Our next speaker is Dr. Mark Kramer, who, of course, known to many of you, as the director of the Harvard Project on Cold War Studies, senior associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, and of course, one of his main functions is to edit the Journal of Cold War Studies. Mark is at home in many archives around the world. He's worked extensively in the newly opened archives in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Russia, Germany, Poland, you name it. He is the author of numerous books and articles on Cold War history. He's the published books on and articles. He's the author of even more, 90% published books and articles on Cold War history, and we're hoping that down the road we'll be able to publish some of his manuscripts as they are finally completed. And as always, it's a great pleasure to have him participate in our meetings as a long-time contributor to the Cold War Project Bulletin and other publications, a long-time partner in this larger Cold War history conspiracy. Mark?
Oh, thank you very much, Christian. Christian didn't start out the introduction for me by saying I had at one time been idealistic, which is appropriate because I've always been a connoisseur of human folly, I think, which is appropriate for the topic that I'm going to speak about. I'm going to talk about the reactions of other East Bloc countries to Charter 77. This is based in part on some recent, because knowing about this seminar, I was recently in Germany and Romania and in Poland. And I won't have enough time to deal with all of the East Bloc countries, but I just want to give a sense of some of the factors. I was also recently in Russia, although the Russian materials I had, most of the materials pertaining to the Soviet Union come mostly from Ukraine and the Baltic states rather than from Russia. The few points to remember at the outset is, first of all, in Moscow, the same leaders were in power in January 1977, who'd been there in August 1968 when the decision was made to invade Czechoslovakia. This wasn't a development that you would expect that they would particularly welcome to have Charter 77 signed, although the situation was very different in the sense that in 1968, Dubček and other reformers associated with the Prague Spring were the ones who ultimately had to deal with the Soviet Union. In this case, there was no question that Gustav Husak's regime was loyal to the Soviet Union. So it was a question of how to deal, as Vilem mentioned toward the end, about how to deal with this phenomenon from below. There was one person who was new on the scene, who was General Kulikov, soon to be Marshal Kulikov, had just been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Warsaw Pact. His predecessor, who was there during the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Marshal Jakubowski, had died in late 1976, and Kulikov was brought in. In 1968, he was in charge. He was the commander of the military district in the Carpathian region, which included most of Ukraine, so he too had overseen a lot of the military preparations for the invasion of Czechoslovakia. In addition, more importantly, I think that Charter 77, and again, Vilem mentioned it briefly, but I'm going to touch on it a little bit greater length. It came after there already had been other movements emerging, in particular the Committee of Workers' Defense. It changed its name, but it basically, the best-known acronym is CORE, the Komitet Obrany Robotnikov. And there was also the Moscow-Helsinki group, led by Yuri Orlov in the Soviet Union and so forth. All, at least indirectly, in some cases very directly, these groups were taking as their inspiration, or at least paying obeisance to the Helsinki Accords, saying that for the most part, if you look at these were organizations that were not proposing to become outright political opposition. In fact, there were people like Yishi Hayek and others associated with Charter 77 who said from the beginning they weren't seeking to become a political opposition. They were seeking to work within the existing framework to make the governments live up to their stated obligations and also to live up to their constitutional guarantees of various human rights. So all of these movements were spearheaded by intellectuals initially. By contrast, later on, Solidarity, which was really a working class movement, part of the reason that the Soviet Union became a good deal more concerned about solidarity was the nature of it. But it was concerned as well about the emergence of these intellectual human rights movements or Helsinki Accord-inspired movements. This was, again, in part because of the rise of Eurocommunism around the same time that you had, especially in Italy and to a lesser extent elsewhere, but you had communist parties that were suddenly beginning to express not support for these kinds of movements, but certainly a good deal of sympathy for them, and to call on the regimes in the Eastern Bloc to think about reaching some sort of accord with them. So that was, again, a consideration that shaped Soviet and other East European perceptions of Charter 77. Now, Soviet reactions to Charter 77 were, again, this is from materials mostly from Ukraine and the Baltic states. There are a few things available in Moscow, but not as much. One thing, though, that is interesting that emerged from Moscow is just the extent of labor unrest in the Soviet Union around this time, particularly in Tula, but elsewhere. That became even more important later when Solidarity emerged. But again, in 1977, there were a couple of significant strikes that occurred that were completely unreported and I think unknown in the West at that point, but in Tula in particular. The Soviet leadership's perception, of course, was shaped by the emergence of the Moscow-Helsinki group. That was clearly a more pressing concern than anything to do with Charter 77. There was also considerable concern about CORE, about the Polish Committee on Workers' Defense. There was even some concern about ferment in East Germany that had begun, where in 1977, 100,000 people had applied to move to West Germany. So all of these factors figured into it. And then when you have prominent figures like Andrei Sakharov who are explicitly expressing support for Charter 77 and also for the Committee on Workers' Defense, that again, it ensured that there would be a harsh reaction to Charter 77, though again, I emphasize it was never a particularly salient issue. It was only part of this larger mix. Charter 77 on its own wasn't the main focus. It was part of this larger concern. What was interesting is that Soviet leaders, and again, I'm thinking here of Brezhnev, Andropov, others of that level, the Politburo level, were particularly angry, not about Václav Havel or about Yishi Hayek or about some of the others who are usually thought of, but the person they were most angry about as a signatory of Charter 77 was František Kriegel, who was a member of the Czechoslovak Presidium in 1968, really the most radical member of the Czechoslovak Presidium in 1968. He was the only one who refused to sign the Moscow Protocols after the invasion, and the Soviet leaders wanted to keep him in Moscow, basically to keep him in prison there. And Dubček and Svoboda, the president, to their credit, insisted on having Kriegel and refused to leave until he was returned. So Kriegel did return to Czechoslovakia, but he remained a focus of animus on the part of the Soviet leadership. The reactions were particularly harsh. Again, it was pretty uniform, but Andropov was especially virulent in one of his conversations with a KGB official in Ukraine. And let me read this just to make sure I get it right. It's one of the more exotic insults I've seen. He said, in condemning Kriegel, he's talking about not so much Charter 77, but Kriegel, he described him as, quote, a vulture trying to resuscitate the carcass of his counter-revolutionary deceptions, unquote. Which is again one of the more bizarre condemnations I've seen, although it's pretty much in keeping with Andropov. Szczerbitsky as well, Szczerbitsky, who was then the party secretary in Ukraine, the head of the Ukrainian Communist Party, was naturally concerned, not again so much about Charter 77 individually, although that was a concern, but what the combination of that with the emergence of CORE would mean for groups in Ukraine, because there was concern, and in fact there were nationalist dissidents, especially in western Ukraine, many of whom had already been sent to the Gulag, but some of whom were still at large. So there were moves to crush the dissident movement in the USSR through various means. These continued all through 1977 and beyond, with the arrest and imprisonment of Shcharansky, the increasing harassment of Sakharov, which of course culminated in his house arrest and arrest in 1980. The crackdown on the Moscow-Helsinki group, including Yuri Orlov. One other aspect of this, though, that, and again, it's where I'll end on the Soviet role here, is there was an effort made, thinking again about the confluence of these various groups, the emergence of them. There was an effort made to seek a joint condemnation. So in March, Suslov was the one who was pushing this, although again, Andropov played a key role in it as well. And there was a meeting in March of 1977, again, just after these groups were really beginning to emerge, before it was clear what would happen to them. This meeting was involved not only all the Warsaw Pact countries, but also Cuba, Mongolia, and Vietnam. And both the private deliberations of that, which are available in the Bulgarian archives, and but also the public statements that were issued. Let me just read quickly from that. It calls, the public communique called for decisively exposing the anti-communist forces and rejecting the campaign directed against the socialist states. This campaign is organized by imperialist circles who are attempting to distort the foreign and internal policies of the socialist states and interfere in their internal affairs. This contradicts the letter and spirit of the final document of the Helsinki European Conference. So there was an effort made there to try to turn the Helsinki Final Act against these groups, knowing that these various groups were appealing to the Helsinki Accord. They issued this communique in an effort to do that. As I say, this was a Soviet orchestrated joint condemnation, but it clearly was one in which all the other East Bloc countries were quite eager to take part. Let me, as the final part of what I say, let me just briefly illustrate with Romania as well, because this is a country, it's pretty well known, the cases in Poland and East Germany and so forth, and even the Soviet Union. But the Romanian case, I think, is less known. I was in Romania the week before last and came across some interesting materials there. The Romanian archives had been very difficult to work in for several years recently, but fortunately over the last year or so, the situation has improved there a lot. Ceausescu was clearly concerned about a spillover from, again, these various movements. He did talk specifically about Charter 77 in Politburo meetings, but he also mentioned CORE. In fact, he mentioned CORE more often. He would refer to the Moscow-Helsinki group and the like. This was important because in February 1977, the dissident novelist Paul Goma, who'd been in prison periodically for various acts, he wrote a letter. It was intended to be, in fact, it was very directly, and it's clear, again, from the materials at that time, it was very directly modeled on Charter 77. And he was seeking to emulate Charter 77, not necessarily in the number of signatories, but in the way, the phrasing of it, and also the idea of a collective appeal. So this appeal, which was urging the Romanian government to show greater respect for human rights that were guaranteed in the Romanian constitution, initially there were only 15 signatories of it. After a brief lull, all of these signatories, including Goma, were arrested, although they were all subsequently released fairly quickly. Quite a few of these, in fact, most of the initial signatories were people who wanted to emigrate. And by and large, the Romanian government solved the initial problem by giving them exit visas, which is, again, part of the reason that the people signed it. Ceausescu denounced these dissidents and also the would-be emigrants, and both publicly and privately. And he described them as traitors, and again, I'm quoting something that he said at a Politburo meeting. He said, "They're parasites carrying out filthy propaganda against this country," unquote. Ceausescu also said at the same meeting, he said that some circles are, quote, "some circles are attempting to use the Helsinki Final Act to interfere in the internal affairs of other nations. We must show that the Helsinki Act bars interference in the internal affairs of other nations." So again, it's the same Soviet idea of turning the Helsinki Act back against these groups. I mean, I found it somewhat interesting to see that there was this effort made, even if it's somewhat far-fetched. It's true that the Romanian dissident community, compared to these other countries, was tiny. Again, if you just look at the number of signatories of the Goma letter, then you'll find it was much smaller. Also, many of them, as I mentioned, were people who wanted to emigrate and subsequently did. Still, though, there were some important figures like the poet Ion Nelătescu, who actually were well known in Romania, not elsewhere, but certainly in Romania. So it did get more attention in Romania than you might have expected. There were other groups, and in particular the Baptist community is about 160,000 or so in Romania, who wrote a 16-page open letter to Ceausescu, again appealing to the Helsinki Accords and asking for freedom of religion. That was dealt with in part by imprisoning the leaders of that group, and subsequently Ceausescu was able to shut that off. Nonetheless, I think in looking at the Romanian case, and I'll draw to an end here, is it does illustrate how there were in the various East Bloc countries concerns about the spillover, and that's why Charter 77, I think, was so significant in a regional context as well, that not just within Czechoslovakia, although clearly that's where it was most important, but was part of this seeming wave of groups that were emerging, and there was a real determination on the part of the leaders of these countries, which they fulfilled pretty successfully, I think, to try to crush these groups, or at least to intimidate them and to keep them at bay. And by and large, despite the importance that some of these groups came to have, I think they were, at least for the first several years, fairly successful at that. So.
Thank you, Mark. Our final speaker is Thomas Blanton. Tom, of course, is the director of the National Security Archive at George Washington University, the largest repository for U.S. government documents declassified through FOIA on American foreign policy. Thomas served in that capacity since 1992. Prior to that, in various other functions at the archive. He's published a host of books, in addition to numerous newspaper articles and op-ed pieces. His books include White House Email, Top Secret Computer Messages the Reagan-Bush White House Tried to Destroy. He co-authored, of course, the famous chronology on the Iran-Contra affair. Is one of three. Is a contributing author of to 3 editions of the ACLU's authoritative guide, Litigation under the Federal Open Government Laws, as well as the Brookings Institution study, Atomic Audit, the Costs and Consequences of U.S. Nuclear Weapons since 1940. He's got several books forthcoming, including, for all the students, a very interesting book on how to read documents. Nobody would know better than Tom. And together with Svetlana Savranskaya, who is here, he's also finishing a document reader on the end of the Cold War, based to a good extent on Anatoly Chernyaev's diaries. Should also say in this round he's also a quiet benefactor of contemporary history in East and Central Europe at a time when much of the interest in this country and much of the funding in this country has gone elsewhere. And part of this larger Cold War network and a longtime partner. I'm glad to turn the mic over to him. Tom.
Thanks, Christian, very much. I used to say at events like this I was really proud to be with fellow spelunkers, coal miners, who would go down into the dark recesses of previously unopened vaults of documents and prowl and dig and pick away at the walls for the little diamonds that would occasionally be hidden there among many lumps of coal and a lot of otherwise useless dirt and pebbles. But I have to say that today it feels more like this group up here that you see are in the role more of prospectors who are standing knee-deep in rushing rivers of evidence. And we need more languages, we need more specialists, and we're panning for specks of gold, but that's just pouring out. And the availability just of this extraordinary publication project is one piece of evidence. I want to come back to that and end with it. But because I'd also love to hear a few questions from you, I want to just shortly say 2 or 3 small things about our subject and about our context. Vilem has so ably gone through the available evidence that we have on this interactive quality of Charter 77 in the international sphere, and the way in which I think the findings currently show a real intensification of Washington's interest in such movements and such standards with the incoming Carter administration. I say Charter administration, Carter. There is a reason why. There are, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, is the old saying. There was already interest, and that's one point I just like to make, is that already before Jimmy Carter was even elected, the United States Congress and others in the United States had already begun to recognize the bankruptcy of realpolitik, the U.S. foreign policy of the previous 8 years. Already Americans were turning, if you will, away from that. Just as Václav Havel is sitting in a courtroom in Prague watching the prosecution. Actually, it was not in Prague. It was in Brno. Where were the plastic people prosecuted?
In Prague.
In Prague. Sitting in that courtroom watching these individuals who had no political stance they were taking. They simply wanted to grow their hair long, take drugs, make music, carve out personal space in which they could live, and yet this was such a profound challenge because Havel and others saw what this meant to the system and were sparked by that process to create the Charter. And just at this moment of sort of the youth movement having an expression, and then through the hands of Havel and Patočka and others who were already saying some of these things, but it became crystallized in the Charter, at the same moment America is going through its own turn away from a realpolitik approach to the world. And the parallels here I find extraordinarily interesting. I've said in other contexts that I think the Charter, in its larger sense, saved the West from realpolitik, which is to say a foreign policy without, in effect, values, but only interests, in the same way that it saved the dissidents of Eastern Europe from socialist utopianism or a convergence theory, and resurrected a different notion of what political culture had to be about. And that's really unfinished business, I would say. But in the United States, you have this intensification of interest crystallized around the Charter, later, of course, by solidarity. My favorite joke on this, and I've told it in Prague at the conference that Vilem and I had the real joy earlier this year, and Svetlana as well, to participate in on an anniversary of the Charter. You know, the one about the the Polish dog meets the Czech dog going across the border into each other's country. And the Czech dog says to the Polish dog, "Why in the world would you want to come here?" And the Polish dog says, "To get something to eat. Why do you want to come to Poland?" And the Czech dog says, "To bark." Okay? Except Charter 77 kind of turns this on its head, because here are the Czech dogs barking very loudly in a way that other dissidents, even at the time, Žilas in Yugoslavia, the New York Times, Le Monde's cartoonist, saw very clearly as the premier challenge, because a challenge of thought, a legalistic, not strident challenge, as the U.S. Telegram says, even though it was the Polish dogs who ultimately really challenged the system. There were 1,889 signers, ultimately, of Charter 77, and how many million Poles who signed up for solidarity. You have a difference of scale, but I would argue a huge commonality of values and approach. In the United States, this found an extraordinary echo. And if there's one lasting consequence of the way in which Charter's crystallization of the human rights thought, of human rights focus, of the turn away from realpolitik, it was first the initiative of Congress in 1975 and 1976. People like the late Republican Millicent Fenwick, or the late Minnesota Democrat Donald Fraser, or James Blanchard of Michigan, or Dante Fascell of Florida, who compelled the United States government to begin to create annual human rights reports on each foreign country. Now, this gave rise to a great deal of hypocrisy later on, in which those reports were moved around a bit to fit certain policy goals, particularly, I would argue, in Latin America. Yet, over time, this congressional initiative that Jimmy Carter then institutionalized with his appointments in the State Department of people like Patricia Darien made the United States government into the premier human rights monitor and collector of human rights evidence in the entire world, dwarfing the combined work of all the NGOs. Human Rights Watch formed from Helsinki Watch at exactly this time because of the contrast with human rights records in Latin America. You have today extraordinary thousands of pages. Just 2 weeks ago, sitting in my office were the prosecutors of Fujimori, the former dictator in Peru, looking for the State Department documents that show how he ran the death squads from his intelligence chief, Montesinos. Those were captured by Americans at the United States Embassy. They're now being introduced as evidence in his trial. This is an extraordinary gift to the world in a long-term historical accountability sense of making the United States government live up to those values which are in Charter 77 about rule of law, about respect for individuals and for human rights. This is an extraordinary long-term consequence. Such documents are the evidence used by every Truth Commission of the last 15 or 20 years. So we can give credit for that development to congressional initiative, to Carter's systematization, and to the clarion call, I think, of the Charter. But let me just make one quick point on the sort of unfinished business, and that is to say, just as the plastic people of the universe were a challenge to both a totalitarian attempt to control personal space and to a kind of a Western consumerist culture in their way. They were an alienated body, and Charter set out to defend that space. There's a good reason why the names of all the committees and dissident groups reflected this role of we are defending the unjustly prosecuted, wherever they are, workers, students. One poll at the conference in March said the only difference between the Czech and Pole dissidents during this period were the Poles were busy defending workers and the Czechs were defending musicians. It was a vast overstatement, but it gets to a point that there are commonalities of these values. But that is unfinished business today. And Jacques Rupnik at our conference in March and again at our panel in New Orleans just a week or two ago lamented the fact that in effect, the inventiveness about democracy represented in the Charter and in the Charter movement really was lost in the 90s as the new democracies of Eastern Europe essentially took up the same old bad habits, the partisanship, the competitiveness rather than the ethics that were called for. Fascinating point, even though Rupnik says Charter was a landmark for the creation of the European public space, as Vilem, I think, is quite well detailed. And I think that significance lives on today. But let me just end with a brief moment of admiration for what this represents. Christian introduced Vilem as an idealist, and indeed, there's nothing more idealistic than publishing documents for history and memory, because what you're saying is not that you yourself are an authoritative voice, not that you yourself have received wisdom, but that people down the road are going to want to read it for themselves, are going to want to make up their own minds, need the evidence, need it firsthand. This is the entire project of the Cold War International History Project at the Wilson Center. This is what Mark has done at the Harvard Center. This is what the National Security Archive is about. And for me, my hero is Vilem Precan, because he did this starting in the 1970s from a little castle in Bavaria where he decided to keep all the samizdat that were circulating. He set up the smuggling routes to get that stuff in and out of Czechoslovakia. He then began publishing. I have 5 or 6 volumes on my shelf that are the precursors of these volumes, which include earlier versions of, here's some memoirs of Charter 77. Here's a festschrift to an extraordinary woman, Eugenia Shlivkova, who was the key organizer of that movement. But here you have all 598 documents of the Charter. Here you have 1,889 signatories of the Charter. Here you have the 35 spokespeople for the Charter. Here you have their memoirs. Here you have the secret police files of their interrogations and their arrests. Here you have the evidence that, as Vilem told me earlier, Jan Patočka asked for his own protocols of his interrogation in order to make sure that they said accurately what he said. And that will be my final thought, because Vilem himself, when he was arrested and interrogated, asked for his protocols. He just told me this. You were not arrested. You were just interrogated.
Only interrogated.
Only interrogated.
It was ambulatory.
There you go. But the point of this story is Vilem turned to his interrogators and said, I must see the protocols. I must make sure that they are correct and exact. I have looked at so many protocols in many, many years going through the archives. And when historians 20 or 30 years from now, in this case 13 years probably, 20 or 30 years from now, come back and look at these documents, they should not say, we could not spell. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Floor is open to questions and comments. Since this session is being webcast, I'd ask that you wait for the microphone and please state your name and affiliation.
I'm Bernd Schaefer, Senior Scholar here at the Wilson Center's Cold War Project. I have a question regarding the security services in Czechoslovakia. To what extent were they able to monitor Charter 77? To what extent were they able to force people to retract signatures, if at all? And were they able in any way to penetrate Charter 77 to a certain extent?
Yeah?
Please.
Yes, they were able to penetrate among the, as we know now, among the first 241 signatories, there were 5 secret collaborators of the police. One of them even asked his officer, his directing officer, that he got something to read and to sign, whether he might to sign.
Allowed.
I was allowed to sign.
Yeah, but the officer didn't understand what is going on. And later some more, but I was surprised at how few there were secret collaborators. Of course, they have technical equipment in many departments. For instance, Pavel Kohout, Ludvík Vaculík. And in this way they did information. But the people was aware that something can be tapped. So, for instance, Pavel Kohout, the first draft of Charter 77 declaration discussed during December, they were not dated 16th, 17th, 18th, but 26th, 27th, 28th. Or Pavel Kohout used a friend from Germany. She learned by heart the text at the Christmas times to inform a journalist in Germany what is going on. But they spoke not about 7th of January as the date the declaration should be published in the West, but about 17th. But the archives of the security police are very useful because they have many of original documents of Charter 77, which were sent to ministries or to Husak or the parliament. They all sent it to the Ministry of Interior.
This is where, for example, the original signature cards are seized by the secret police and now recovered by Vilem and his colleagues. And of course, the Slivkova herself ended up being arrested several years later because of a penetration by a secret police agent, a former political prisoner, actually, in that network that was moving the Samizdat material back and forth to Vilem's Czechoslovak Documentation Center. So, yes, and yet at the same time, there's a reflected in some of the discussions at the Politburo level, there's concern, but not really. There's a sense of their being isolated, and I don't know. Maybe you could speak about that briefly. In the Czech Communist parties, at the top, Husak and others' reaction to Charter 77.
How they interpreted Charter 77. The Presidium of...
How would you summarize it?
Just summarize it.
No, to summarize it, that Charter 77 is a contra-revolutionary document aiming on bourgeois democracy and so on. As a so they understood better than many critics of Charter that she is too soft and doesn't challenge the regime and is not political. But Husak and his companions, they understood how political it is.
If I could just quickly add on the point that Tom raised is Szczerbitsky, the Ukrainian party leader and a full member of the Soviet Politburo, met with Czechoslovak officials, senior Czechoslovak officials during this time. I think in February and in May and in September, I think, of 1977, and they were telling him, at least, that they believed that Charter 77 was isolated and would remain a marginal group. But they did use the very language that Vilem just mentioned about a counter-revolutionary group of not malcontents, but something of that order, who are seeking to restore a bourgeois order in Czechoslovakia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Other questions? Yes, sir.
My name is Martin Wennick. I'm retired State Department. Lived in Prague on 2 occasions from 65 to 67, and then from 81 to 83, serving at the embassy. And I would like to go to the issue of the number of signatures of Charter 77 and its relationship to society, and why at the end, after we've talked about 12 years, 1977 to 1989, in a country of millions of people, at the end of the day you only had 1,700 or 1,800 signatures, the vast majority of them who would be categorized as intellectuals, with very few of them coming from the general population. And is there a way to explain why Charter 77 really never caught on with the, quote, if you can call it that, the average citizen of Czechoslovakia during that period?
Go ahead.
This was a question. Why
was Charter 77 limited to a circle of intellectuals but didn't catch on with the general population?
This is the same question. Why millions of people made their own private capitulation at the beginning of 17th. The promises in 1968, we never submit, we never, and so on. And three years later, 98% voters went to and voted for the candidates of the National Front. Why? It was the existential fear, and then the regime and its apparatus, they know how to make clear what can they are hot focuses, hot places, and if you touch it, you can hurt. What you can lose your vocation. Your children are not allowed to go to the to the college or to the university, etc. Children as hostages. Why millions of people accommodated? That's the question.
Yes. If you could please, excuse me, if you could please wait for the microphone. And if you could please state your name.
Verna Conant. I lived in Czechoslovakia until 1980, and I can testify that the elections were always rigged. You know, when you went to election and you didn't want to put your vote there was either the predseda Národního výboru nebo někdo jiný or somebody else who put the vote there for you. And this happened in the 70s several times, that in my village we fulfilled the election in 112%. That meant that several persons, they were people who were not really responsible, people were afraid, and many people at the election put the vote there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will say it was too many things even in the real existing socialisms, what one could lose. Not to, if he not accommodated. But fortunately, there were people they did not accommodate it.
Mark?
Just very quickly, if I could, to go back to that question, is in the case of Poland, in August 1980, when the question about the strikes in the shipyards, especially in Gdansk, emerged, the core intellectuals who had gone there to help out with various matters, they were actually urging a much more cautious approach than was actually adopted about not going too far. There were some among the workers who really were the galvanizing force behind Solidarity, who were inclined to go along with that. But ultimately, people who made the decisions, Valentinovich, Valenza, etc., they decided that they weren't confident that it was going to succeed. In fact, what's striking, if you look at the discussions that they were having at that time, was they thought that the authorities would crush them. But they pressed ahead, and once having shown that the authorities wouldn't actually do that, that's how I think that they managed to develop this truly mass movement with ultimately, as Tom mentioned, about 10 million people. And that's what I think was really missing in Czechoslovakia, is that there wasn't this demonstration that the authorities would not use whatever coercion, whatever force was necessary to suppress mass dissent. That had pretty well been decided after 1968, and that's what I think was really missing there, in line with what you just mentioned.
What do you think, Mark? What is the difference in the economic situation in both countries?
Yeah, it's true. That's.
I'm asking.
No. It's a good point to bear in mind. Is that by and large, the economic situation was considerably more stable in Czechoslovakia at this time than it was in Poland. The real difficulties hadn't quite emerged yet in 1976-77, but still, even in 76, when higher meat prices were announced, it did spark very large-scale protests in Radom and a couple of other Polish cities that the authorities quickly backed down on. And in that sense, there wasn't the same kind of economic crisis in Czechoslovakia, so it wasn't, again, the same sort of catalyst for a mass movement. So that too has to be borne in mind.
Well,
What I meant, that we lack the social history of the country.
Quick question in the back, but we're almost out of we are out of time. We're well beyond our time. So if you could just be real brief, and we'll get it.
Michael Sporer, University of Maryland, University College. I just wanted to add something to what Mark said, that it is little known, but in point of fact, the intellectuals got to the core people got to Gdańsk rather late in the course of the strike. The strike really could not be seriously defeated after the third day or fourth day of the strike, where the entire city just exploded, and it had largely to do with the influence of the church. And I don't know how much, nobody has really commented on that difference.
Thank you. I think it's
the Pope.
Yeah, I think it's a discussion that we should continue over a glass of wine. Let me thank our panelists, in particular Professor Precan, for coming all the way from Prague, and let me thank him on behalf of the Wilson Center for this remarkable collection and congratulate him on his achievement.